I see already almost 80 participants have joined us. Thank you very much. It is great to see so many of you join us here today. Since we have a really busy agenda, I will just go ahead and get us started. My name is Stephanie. I'm a senior advisor at Adelphi, and I will be moderating today's event, which is co-hosted also with the Öko-Institut. We will have 3 presentations by Laurence Graff from the European Commission, by Dr. Lambert Schneider, who's co-hosting this event from the Öko-Institut, and Michelle Adam from IATA. And these presentations will then be followed by reactions from Peter Liese from the European Parliament, Gilles de Frazen from Carbon Market Watch, Eva Wakeman from IATA, and Andrew Murphy from Transport and Environment. Now, in terms of order, because Peter Liese has to leave relatively early, we will try to have his intervention right after Laurence's intervention. However, he is apparently having troubles joining our event. So hopefully that will work. So don't be surprised if there's a little bit of shuffling on that front. Now, to get us started, I would like to give a few words of context. First of all, on aviation. So we know that aviation is responsible for 2 to 3% of global CO2 emissions, and that domestic emissions are covered by UNFCCC, but international ones are not. And these are covered under the International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO. Now, we also know that these 2 to 3% of global CO2 emissions are only part of the climate effect of aviation, because about 2/3 of climate effects are non-CO2. And these are effects that we haven't yet started to address, really. But in order to address the CO2 effects, ICAO has put in place a basket of measures, and this is only about international aviation, right? So they want to look at operational technical improvements, alternative fuels, and compensation through carbon credits. And this is what you see here, an important role for each of these elements. And it is going to be on this green element here that we will be focusing on today, which is the carbon offsetting and reduction scheme for international aviation, which is quite a mouthful and goes by CORSIA. So this was adopted in 2016, and we've seen implementing regulation being put in place between 2018 and 2020. And it basically establishes offsetting requirements for airlines above a certain baseline. It will function in 3 phases. The pilot phase starts in 2021, the first phase in 2024, and the second phase in 2027, where participation in the pilot phase is voluntary. It covers only international flights and only CO2. And we have 88 countries participating in the pilot phase. And in these 88 countries, we're notably missing China, India, Brazil, and Russia, which together account for about 20% of traffic activity. So that much in terms of my very brief introduction and context. Before I give the floor to Laurence, I would ask everyone, if you have questions during the presentation, please add them to the chat, noting please to whom you are asking these questions, because we will have the presentations, the reactions, and I really want to make sure we get to your questions at the end, and we have about 15 to 20 minutes of questions, but I need to know to whom you're asking those questions. So please note that in your question in the chat. And so with that, and without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Laurence Graff, who has had troubles connecting to the webinar and is joining us via phone. And I will ask my colleague to start sharing the slides. And Laurence, please go ahead, and you have the floor.
Thank you, Stephanie, and good morning, everybody. Very, very sorry not to be able to see you all, and I couldn't really connect other than by phone still. Very happy to be with you today for this event, and many thanks for the invitation. Very pleased to be part of it. Now, a bit similarly to what you just did, Stephanie, what I would propose to do, starting, with my presentation, starting with slide 2, is just to recall a bit of context and where we come from on aviation ETS, and what's going on internationally, because I think that's important to keep in mind what happened since and where we are now. So where do we come from? As you will all recall, I think this is not a new topic. I think we, for a long time, wanted to get a concrete measure from ICAO, and before that, we have put in place the ETS at EU level. In order to boost the international process, we decided to limit the scope of the ETS, originally foreseen as covering all flags from and to the EU, to intra-EEA flights only, in parallel to boost the international process. And that allowed for, indeed, the CORSIA resolution to be agreed upon in 2016, and later on the implementation elements. So that's where we ended the discussion and the co-decision back in 2017, where we agreed again to sort of stop the clock and keep the reduced scope for the ETS pending the completion of the international process on CORSIA. So that was the general thrust of the co-decision package back then, where you will also recall that we agreed on the linear reduction factor being applicable to aviation this time around from 2021 onwards. And also we agreed importantly on the next review, assuming that by then the CORSIA sort of implementation picture or package would indeed be there. So the next review will indeed, and that was already agreed then, look into the increased share of auctioning and how to implement CORSIA in the EU. And what was agreed as a matter of principle is that CORSIA would be agreed through the ETS as a matter of principle. If we now move to the third slide, sorry, but I don't see them, so that's why I'm giving that indication. In order to do that and to have an informed also decision making, then it was agreed that we would have a thorough assessment of CORSIA and be looking into its key design elements, and also importantly into the level of participation, the enforceability. You see there the number of issues that are specifically listed in Article 28(b)(2) of the revision agreed in 2017. So the idea was indeed to engage in the next review in the light of what would have been agreed internationally, so CORSIA as such, and how it is being implemented, and the level of participation. As Stephanie said, since 2016, ICAO has agreed a number of implementing measures through the so-called SARP, notably focusing on MRV rules, but also on the first wave of eligible offsets, for instance, with also to keep in mind that the second wave is being processed at the moment on the agenda of the ICAO Council in November. But so I think this assessment will indeed be made. Then coming to the proposal of the next review, I think the 2017 agreement gives us a number of very important parameters that we need to keep in mind also, and notably the need to be to fully preserve the EU economy-wide greenhouse gas emission reduction commitment for 2030 under the Paris Agreement, so that we would not, go into any kind of backsliding when implementing CORSIA through the EU ETS. That's a very, very important parameter, obviously, that we need to keep in mind, not least because of the difference in nature between the ETS and between the EU commitment, by the way, and the Paris and CORSIA relying on international credits. Against that, and following that, and following what has been agreed in ICAO, the EU agreed, I think it was last June, on member states participating in CORSIA. There was an EU decision agreed by the Council, subject to the differences that were filed back in 2018 and new to come if needed. The idea there was to fully preserve the policy space in the EU and the ETS more generally, as well as, of course, linked to this, the level of climate ambition that we have in the EU. So that was made clear, as this was made clear, by the way, already at the time during the ICAO Assembly at the end of 2019. So that was the international context. Now, in the EU, and equally important, complementing what was agreed in 2017, you will have noticed that we have a Green Deal, and most recently further elaborated by the Commission through the Climate Target Plan for 2030, and that's the fifth slide that I would wish to put to you, to recall that indeed now we are moving from minus 40% to at least minus 55% in 2030 compared to 1990 levels, and with, of course, all sectors to be addressed. Because again, we're talking about an economy-wide commitment, including, of course, aviation, and of course, this time around shipping. Importantly, we're talking about domestic emission reductions. I'm saying that again to make the point that we will not be using in the EU international credits to comply with our commitment. And again, it's important to keep in mind because CORSIA is based on the use of international credits. So by nature, the ETS and CORSIA are different, and that will have implications on the assessment that we will be making, that we will be refining along the way, and of course the legislative proposal. You will have seen also that in the Climate Target Plan that was agreed by the Commission most recently, mention is made of course, aviation and shipping, with a clear indication, in as far as aviation is concerned, that the EU will continue to regulate at least intra-EU aviation emissions through the ETS. So I think that's an important signal that was given there and that we need to build upon. On the sixth slide, sorry, you will see the process. You don't know if everybody is familiar with that, but we, in order to come up with a new legislative proposal, we follow the better regulation standard rules and procedures, starting with an inception impact assessment that was published a while ago in July, giving an opportunity for all stakeholders to provide initial comments. And it was followed on the 1st of October by an open public consultation that is still running, still open until mid-January next year. And then on the basis of this, and of course, the work that we're conducting internally, we will put forward a proposal in June next year, together with the rest of the package that will form the Green Deal package. So coming up with many other proposals that altogether should bring us where we need to be in terms of emission reduction. On the 7th slide, and the last one, this is just to give an indication of the key options we're looking into when it comes to implementing CORSIA by the EU and through the EU ETS, basically ranging from one extreme to the other. You still hear me?
Yes, we can, Laurence. Perfectly.
Okay, good. So generic options, I would say, ranging from full scope ETS to CORSIA only, with in the middle a number of mixed sort of options, with ETS CORSIA called clean cut, with CORSIA basically for extra EA flights, ETS for intra, or a completely mixed one with CORSIA and ETS together in a combined manner within the EU and CORSIA for the extra. And the last one, you know, just because it's the way CORSIA is designed, with based on operators themselves, yeah, for the sake of being complete. So it will not necessarily exhaust, you know, the list of options. We will most probably have sub options. Obviously, it's likely to focus. We will have a great deal of work on the mixed options, as you can imagine. But that's where we are. That's what we are working on in order to conduct the impact assessment. So basically, looking at the various types of impact impacts we need to look into in terms of climate, in terms of economic and social economic impact, the level playing field, of course, which is key, the administrative burden. Well, you all know that. So that's what we're looking into at the moment, against the basic parameters I gave you earlier in my presentation, in relation to especially the climate ambition we need to preserve. So that's where we stand, basically. Yeah, I would leave it there, and of course be ready to take up questions, if any, on this. And I guess I think the next presentation will complement that, because I think we will have an interesting presentation also from industry, and then from one of the last decisions that was taken in ICAO on the change of the CORSIA baseline, that we will look into, of course, as well.
Exactly. Many, many thanks, Laurence, for the really informative presentation. I wanted to have Peter Liese follow your presentation, but he hasn't been able to join yet. And by the way, there are already questions to you in the chat, and we will get to them, Laurence, towards the end of the event. I would next like to give the floor to Dr. Lambert-Schneider, also co-host of this event, for his intervention. And I would urge all panelists to try to please keep your interventions brief so that we make sure to get to the questions in the end. Thank you. Lambert, go ahead. We can't hear you yet,
yes.
Lambert. Yeah. I think you need to put it in full screen. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm trying to manage the presentation and everything at the same time. Thank you very much. So I will talk briefly on a topic which Laurence already touched upon, and that is the discussions on what baselines to use for CORSIA. So the goal of CORSIA, or the broader goal under ICAO, is to achieve carbon neutral growth from 2020 onwards. So the original idea was that the emissions, including through offsetting, do not go beyond 2020 levels. Then in the operationalization, a 2019-2020 baseline was actually used, so the average of 2 years, because that's more representative maybe than a single year. And then, of course, emissions in 2020 dropped heavily because the airline industry was heavily affected by COVID-19. And as a consequence of that, based on a proposal by IATA and others, only a 2019 baseline was decided for the pilot phase from 2021 to 2023. And for future phases, this still needs to be considered. And so the fear was that with low emissions in 2020, that could lead to higher offsetting requirements for the industry, which is already hard hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. However, this change has two effects, and we found that quite interesting. So on the one hand, you have a lower baseline, which means you need more offsetting. But on the other hand, the pandemic also affects future emissions. And so also the future emissions pathway will likely be much lower than before the crisis anticipated. And so that leads to less offsetting needed. And so the two effects partially could balance each out other. Here you see a slide what the effect of previous recessions was on CO2 emissions from aviations. And as you can see, the Gulf War, the oil crisis, all the previous crises led to a lower emissions pathway. And that lower emissions pathway continued for several years. And the kind of previous trend was usually never reached again. So all the crises kind of declined emissions, not only for a couple of years, but for a longer pathway. And so that's also the expectation of the COVID-19 pandemic. So the green line here is kind of a bit reference scenario before the pandemic. And then the question is, how will emissions evolve in the next year due to the pandemic? So we constructed these two scenarios based on assumptions or data from ICAO and IATA and some own assumptions. And so the key question is, how deep will be the drop in 2020? So by now, we published this earlier this year, by now the red line seems more likely than the blue line. And then also the questions like, how quickly will grow emissions thereafter and recover? And you see the dotted lines, that's basically the baseline which arises from that. And then we looked at the offsetting requirements in the reference scenarios and in these two scenarios under the COVID-19 pandemic. And what's quite interesting is in the overall picture that because of the two effects, on the one hand, you have a lower baseline, but you have also lower emissions in the future, the offsetting demand or the offsetting requirements for the industry do not change considerably if a 2019-2020 baseline would be maintained, because we have these two effects. And also interestingly, under some scenarios, there's no demand at all, even with the previous baseline in the pilot phase. Now, what does it mean that now a 2019 baseline has been used? So for the pilot phase on the left-hand side, it means there will be no offsetting demand from airlines for the pilot phase. And in the first phase, depending on the scenario, there could also be very limited or no requirements for offsetting. And overall, the offsetting requirements or the mitigation efforts the industry needs to take beyond the effect that the COVID-19 pandemic had are reduced considerably in all scenarios if the 2019 baseline would be maintained beyond the pilot phase and also for the subsequent phases until 2035. So to conclude, the change to a 2019 baseline means that there will be no offsetting requirements in the pilot phase and maybe also no offsetting requirements in the first phase. The shape of future recovery will be important. but many estimates assume that maybe even future growth rates of aviation will be lower, for example, because we have a lot of digitization now, and maybe there will be less business travel, etc. We don't know yet, but it's for sure that it will take several years for the industry to recover to 2019 levels. So we estimate that a 2019 baseline for future phases could imply that about 0.7 to 1.9 gigaton less abatement efforts over the whole period of 2021 to 2035, compared to a scenario without COVID, and also similar compared to a scenario if COVID-19 would be maintained, if the 2019-2020 baseline would be maintained. So in our view, it's important that this issue of using a 2019 baseline is reconsidered for the period after 2040. Here, last slide, a quick outlook on key issues for CORSIA's environmental impact beyond this baseline issue. So we think it's quite important to review the ambition of the current goal, which is carbon neutral growth, and to align the goal with the Paris Agreement goals. It's important to consider the baseline issue, which we just elaborated. And then it's also important to consider the non-CO2 impacts from aviation. As Stephanie said in the introduction, the CO2 impact is only about 1/3, and 2/3 are non-CO2 effects. There are many different effects from cirrus trails, etc. A key outstanding issue is also avoiding double counting with the Paris Agreement. I would say here ICAO has done its homework, and it's mainly up to the parties under the UNFCCC to ensure that under Article 6 rules are put in place that double counting is avoided with CORSIA. And then, of course, last issue, which is also heavily debated, is the quality of the carbon credit units which are used under CORSIA. Here, the vintages are quite important. So whether old and running projects can be used, or whether new projects need to be developed to meet demand. And one decision caught my attention, and that's the decision on non-permanence taken under ICAO, which implies that non-permanence only needs to be addressed until the end of the scheme in 2035 or 2037. And that's a very short time frame. And so if you have an afforestation plantation and the trees are cut, later on the CO2 goes back to the atmosphere in the worst case, and then you have offset these emissions with kerosene. Cumulatively, there's the same amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. So this is an inadequately short time frame in my assessment. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Lambert, also for keeping to time. I would now like to give the floor to Michelle Adam for the next intervention.
Thanks, Stephanie. Hello, everyone, and thanks for the invitation. Let me just make sure you can see the slides in full screen mode. Perfect.
Yes, we can.
So thanks again, really, and hello, everyone. It's actually very convenient for me that my presentation follows Lambert's, because it kind of allows me to move slightly away from numbers and focus a bit more on the higher level picture and policy considerations also behind the change of baseline. And I'm quite happy not to have to spend too much time talking about recovery scenarios. To be frank, I kind of feel that attempting to forecast aviation's emissions at this time is as reliable as trying to come up with the daily horoscope for a local newspaper. But there are a few certainties. The first one is, as Lambert said, if offsetting requirements increase if you lower the baseline, but offsetting requirements also decrease if emissions from aviation decrease. And that's indeed what you could see in the second scenario that was presented before. A lot of the impact was related to emissions decreasing to relatively low levels. And talking about low levels, well, we don't know what emissions from aviation will look like in 5, 10, or 15 years. What we know with certainty, again, is that they are bottom low in 2020. We estimate that they will be around the same levels as in 1992. So that's about 30 years ago. And I think everyone will agree that last year, no one had expected that we would be hit by such a global human and economic crisis in 2020. So my first question is it really reasonable to set a benchmark for aviation when the global fleet is grounded as a result of a global crisis? Another important question, in my view, is what is really CORSIA's objective? And I think here people who have been following this topic, who have been engaged in the negotiations that led to its adoption now 4 years ago, and also have read the ICAO resolutions carefully, will have noted indeed that the objective is to stabilize net CO2 emissions. And obviously the intention was never to take levels equivalent to 1990 as benchmark. Yes, the impact of the economic recession means, or is likely to mean, that traffic will not recover before several years, and emissions will indeed probably remain under the baseline for some time if we're using 2019 as baseline. But that does not mean that ICAO's aspirational target is not met, or that CORSIA is not effective. Emissions will be stabilized, even though obviously we as aviation industry regret that this outcome is achieved through a result, as a result of a massive reduction in traffic, rather than technology, operations, or sustainable aviation fuels. And as much as I think it is great if aviation can contribute to healthy carbon markets, whether it's through mandatory mechanisms like CORSIA or voluntary commitments, the purpose of CORSIA has never been to create a continuous flow of investment from aviation to carbon markets. The principle has always been that our priority is to keep emissions from aviation down, and it's only if we can't keep them at baseline levels, at CNG levels, that CORSIA would step in and make sure that the net levels are maintained. So in a way, if emissions are below baseline levels, there should not be any need to rely on carbon offsetting. The problem, if you look at the effectiveness of CORSIA from the angle of offsetting requirements, is that you don't really get any indication of how the sector is performing. You get an indication of how much money goes from aviation to other sectors, but that's about it. As I said before, and as Lambert noted, you do get higher offsetting requirements by imposing a more stringent baseline, but you also get higher offsetting requirements if aviation's emissions increase, which I assume is not what anyone would want. So are really offsetting requirements a good way to measure the effectiveness of the global approach? I'm really not sure. The other point to keep in mind, and Lambert, you said the concern of the industry was the higher offsetting requirements that would result from the more stringent baseline. Of course, I'm not going to lie, I'm not going to say that the cost impacts on the industry were not a factor. But it's not as simple as that. There are other impacts that were greater concerns for us from a policy perspective. Of course, it's great to have more environmental impact, greater environmental impact, and that's what we would have had through a more stringent baseline. That's in theory. In practice, if 2020 was still in the equation, I'm not sure that we wouldn't necessarily have reached a greater environmental impact. For many states, this would have been a showstopper. And we were extremely concerned that if ICAO had not reached the decision it reached, we would have lost some of the key volunteering states and also undermined our chances of getting ICAO to agree on an ambitious long-term goal. We have to remember that our world is changing. Aviation's center of gravity is moving east towards economies that have a much higher growth potential than the markets in developed states and Europe in particular. And as you probably know, it is a real challenge to get political support for a market-based measure that is still seen by many as an obstacle to the growth of their economies. And losing the support in key regions such as Southeast Asia, in our view, would have been a real failure. I don't think you can pretend to be leading if no one is following you. Finally, the other point which is key is our focus is now on 2050. And as many of you know, ICAO has prioritized that work at the last assembly, and we really are determined to get ICAO to agree on a target which is at least equivalent to the industry's target. And I would actually encourage you, just as a last point, to check a report which was published by ATAG a few weeks ago, and which looks at the different potential pathways to 2050 and beyond. Thanks.
Many thanks, Michel. I would next like to call on Gilles Dufrazen from Carbon Market Watch for his reaction. Please keep it brief, and the floor is yours. Thank you, Gilles.
Sure, thanks a lot. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for the interesting presentations. So to us, it's been pretty clear for a while that CORSIA is falling far short of the level of ambition that's needed to address the climate crisis. Of course, there have been a lot of discussions around the baseline change. We do think it was a mistake to change the baseline, but even before this baseline change, CORSIA was already far below what we need to really address the crisis we're facing. There are different reasons for that. I think Lambert addressed some of them. The question of what the goal of CORSIA is, first of all, is a very crucial one. The objective of carbon neutral growth in itself is really insufficient. If we look at what is actually going to be covered by CORSIA, it's actually a very small portion of the climate impact of the aviation sector. So we're not tackling non-CO2 effects. We're not tackling domestic flights. We are only, and crucially, only tackling the growth in emissions. So we're really doing nothing about all the emissions below that 2019 baseline, which are a huge portion of the climate impact. So we end up with a system that's going to cover probably less than 10% of the overall climate impact of the aviation sector, if you take into account the non-CO2 impacts, domestic flights, etc. So really, the goal and the coverage of the system itself is completely inappropriate in the way we see it. And then there is the second issue around the quality of the credits used. There is sometimes this assumption that since the eligibility was defined by ICAO, which is a UN agency, then we can trust that the quality will be maintained. And unfortunately, I don't think that's the case. For example, credits from the Clean Development Mechanism, the CDM, will be eligible. This is a very controversial system. There are diverse views on the quality of those credits, but I think it's pretty clear that many credits don't represent credible emission reductions. And actually, you don't need to take my word for it, because if you look at the technical report from ICAO, so the ICAO tab, which was tasked with assessing the eligibility of the programs, the CDM is the program that failed the most criteria. So it failed several of the eligibility criteria, and yet it is eligible on the CORSIA. And I'm just stating this as an example to say the eligibility decisions and the type of credits that will be used on the CORSIA, this was not the result of a purely technical analysis. It was a political compromise. And so there will be a responsibility on the part of airlines to do the due diligence and make sure they only purchase the right carbon credits. So yeah, I have very little time, so I'm not going to go into more detail. But in short, we really think that much more is needed than CORSIA, and we would urge, in particular, the EU to go forward with regional action. We think the ETS needs to be revised. That's on the way, and that's a good thing. We need an immediate and complete phase out of free allocation and the adoption of kerosene taxation. So it's clear the aviation sector is facing a climate crisis, but we don't think CORSIA is a solution to that, unfortunately.
Thank you, Gilles. I would like to call on Eva Waitman from AITA for your reactions. Thank you, Eva.
Thank you, Stephanie. I hope you can hear me. So first of all, thank you for the opportunity to speak here today. And I've got a couple of points following the presentations today. So first, I would say that CORSIA is the first global sector-wide scheme in any industry sector that's aimed at curbing CO2 emissions, which I think is important to recognize, because that the ambition of its effort is without doubt. The phased approach that was chosen was to make it easier for states and the airlines to join a scheme that they have never sort of been part of, not been used to, apart from maybe some airlines that are under the EU emissions trading scheme. So the ambition as such is rising in its design throughout the various phases. But of course, then COVID-19 struck, and the world has changed, and undoubtedly this has hit the aviation sector probably more than many other sectors. As Lambert was showing, many analyses show that there is going to be a very small or indeed no demand in the pilot and perhaps the first phase of CORSIA. And I would say, from what I'm hearing from our members, there has been this feeling among many carbon market participants that CORSIA has been kicked into this sort of long grass. I like to think about it of more like a 4-week kind of a grass if you live here in England. And I hear from our members that at some point the discussions with airlines about purchasing carbon offsets has almost halted, but it is coming back very, very, very slowly. But I wouldn't say that that has put CORSIA on hold. Airlines still have to monitor their emissions. They still have to report them in 2019 and 2020, even though 2020 is not part of the baseline. They have to start thinking about their procedures, internal procedures, and ask themselves questions about what type of credits they want to purchase, how they're going to go about it, whether to enter the market or whether to invest in projects themselves. So all of these efforts have not stopped, and they are still going forward. So I would also say that CORSIA is absolutely unique, and it is a pioneer in many respects, and I think it does deserve credit for that. And an important thing that CORSIA, I think, is doing is to set a project benchmark, which is important for the wider carbon markets. So ICAO and its technical advisory body has played an important role in setting the standard for credits that are to be accepted internationally. And I think that is a huge undertaking. And as I said, we should probably remember to give them credit for that.
Many thanks, Eva. I would next call on Andrew for his remarks, and then we can take questions. And I would like to encourage all participants to put your questions in the chat, including the person you are addressing your question to. Thank you. Andrew.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So let's, get the question right here, because at the start of the presentation, there was a reference made to international aviation emissions being covered by ICAO and not by national targets. To be clear, the Paris Agreement covers all emissions, domestic and international aviation emissions. And ICAO have no role in international aviation emissions, legally speaking. The Kyoto Protocol asks member states to work through ICAO. The Paris Agreement makes no reference to them. So Europe's NDC explicitly includes international aviation emissions. There is no role for ICAO. And how states decide to address aviation emissions, which are their responsibility, states can decide to combine measures of national, regional, and international. So the question is it worth going to ICAO, and is it worth having an international measure? And I think we do have to look at the value of CORSIA after all these recent developments and ask ourselves, is this worth the effort? And are we actually getting something which will reduce aviation emissions in the long run? And I think the baseline change to CORSIA is pretty instructive as to how measures are going to be developed in ICAO and what the effectiveness is going to be. We could have waited until the COVID dust had settled to decide on the baseline, because airlines aren't required to purchase offsets for some years now. But instead, within weeks of COVID-19 occurring, it was immediately decided to change the baseline. And what IATA said to governments when they lobbied them, and we know this from documents which have been released from Freedom of Information requests, IATA said, and Michel is smiling because he knows what I'm going to say, IATA said that now is the time for us to change the baseline, because in a year's time, sympathy will have receded. So now's our chance to weaken the scheme. So, and then, we now hear it was Asian countries and concern for other countries that they'd drop out of CORSIA. No, sorry, it was industry lobbying which said, let's weaken the measure even further. And this is precisely the problem we have. Every opportunity ICAO has to develop a measure, be they CO2 standards or be they offsetting mechanisms. It's industry which comes along, away from transparency, away from parliamentarians, away from media, and weakens the measure. So I think at this stage, we do have to, as Michel Adams says, follow what's happening in the world. We are moving away from top-down global measures. And instead, we're seeing more and more countries adopt net zero targets. The EU, China, Japan, South Korea. We should give up on international measures for aviation. And instead, international aviation emissions should be fully incorporated into national net zero targets. And governments themselves or bilaterally should agree on industrial policies, fuels policies, aircraft policies, reducing airport capacity. And I think this idea of having, a review process in 4 years or 5 years' time to see if we can make an offsetting mechanism work better, with respect, I doubt it's the best use of everyone's time. And I think, we've given CORSIA and ICAO a fair shot. We've given them 2 decades. We have an offsetting scheme and a CO2 standard which won't work for about another decade. So, I think now is the time to move on and see what other measures we can all work on to reduce emissions from this sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, also for speaking to other panelists, and I'm very happy to hear and see everyone talking to each other, and I look forward to the discussion that we have starting now. Now, unfortunately, our last respondent hasn't been able to join, and that's Peter Liese from the European Parliament, but it does give us a few extra minutes for Q&A. I have questions for each of you, and in that context, then you could also respond to what you have heard from the other panelists, and we can have a bit of a conversation like that. I hope that Laurence is still with us and can hear us. Laurence, are you still there? I can't hear her. So I will try to reach Laurence, and in the meantime, I have a few questions. I have a question. I will start with one of the last ones. I have a question from Ellen Swarbrick to Gilles. It says, I have a question about the use of CRs under CORSIA. There are concerns about quality, but also the price of CRs is so low due to oversupply. Would airlines realistically have an economic incentive to reduce emissions based on this? That is the question from Ellen to Gilles.
Well, thanks for the question. I think the really short and easy answer is no. That clearly doesn't set a realistic incentive, for example, to buy sustainable alternative fuels. I mean, the price of these fuels is just incomparably higher than the price of carbon credits. I also don't think this is the objective of CORSIA. So CORSIA is not a carbon pricing tool. If it was, then it shouldn't be offsetting, because offsets by definition drive the carbon price to the lowest level, since we're trying to reach the cheapest abatement options available. So really, whether it's CERs or other credits, there are no carbon credits out there that set a realistic signal or incentive for decarbonizing the aviation sector. And just a quick comment on the overall discussion. I think one of the key issues here is that we're trying to adapt the climate crisis and climate policies to make them fit the aviation business model that's based on a lot of growth, when we should be doing the opposite and adapting the aviation business model to fit the climate crisis and making sure that we address that crisis.
Thank you. I have a bunch of questions here that I'm having trouble sorting. I have a quick question, which perhaps Michel and Andrew can pitch in, from Ben Garside. Have any governments given airline bailouts that point the way to additional climate measures?
can start. Yeah, there have been a few governments which have indeed attached some environmental conditions to bailouts. I'm sure Andrew will say not stringent enough, and not enough states have done so. Our view, and we've been asked a few times our views on that. Our perspective was that trying to regulate the climate impacts of aviation through the bailout measures was just not the right way to do it. Without questioning, it's not so much a question of whether those sort of targets are good or bad. It's just a question of how do you regulate an industry? Do you regulate it right in the middle of the crisis or not? I'm sure we'll have very diverging views on that.
Andrew, before I give you the floor, I would just like to add a question. So maybe you can respond to both of them. And so it's a question from Jana Elbrecht, and she says, it's actually a question for Michelle, but I think both of you can pitch in. The global conversation is shifting towards the target of carbon neutrality in 2050, including in some increasingly important economies in Asia, such as China, Japan, and Korea. So Jana's question is, how can the aviation sector fit into this picture if its emissions will stay so far above 1990 levels until 2035? What is the vision beyond CORSIA's second phase?
So to answer the bailout question, I think Michelle has a point. It is difficult to do climate policy through bailouts. And it is difficult to look at one airline and say, you must decarbonize because you're getting a bailout, because it raises the question as to what the rest of the sector and what the other airlines are doing. I think instead of, so we need to, I think we look at a bigger picture at this. And I think a lesson from this climate crisis is, up until last year, the aviation sector told us we're an international sector. We're international, and therefore we need to have international regulation. But as soon as COVID-19 came along, all of a sudden the sector wasn't particularly international anymore. It was very national when it needed bailouts. And we didn't go to ICAO and develop a single global bailout scheme for aviation to avoid competition issues. So I think there is a point here that if these airlines really are requiring state aid and state support, then I think they should be subject to national and state climate policies. And on the question of net zero, I think it's a great question, because what will get us to net zero in 2050? And what we know about the aviation sector is it takes a lot of time to decarbonize it. It's a difficult sector to decarbonize, but it's not impossible. And so the work needs to start now in 2020. And so the question is, what are we doing in 2020, which in 2050 will get us to zero? And I think if we're getting to zero in 2050, let's paint a positive story here. Let's look back and let's ask ourselves, what do we do in 2020 to get to zero? And I don't think it's an offsetting scheme. I do think it's about investing in different types of aircraft, different types of fuels. And there's only so much money in the world, so many hours in the day, and so many people involved in this sector. And I just think our efforts are much better focused on the non-offsetting things we can do to reduce emissions rather than the offsetting.
Do other panelists want to jump in on this one?
I'm happy just to react, and almost makes me uncomfortable saying I agree with Andrew on this one. But no, I think it's, and I've seen other questions in the chat that point in that direction. I think, yes, obviously CORSIA is important. Market-based measures, whether it's ETS, CORSIA are important. But I think if we want to decarbonize aviation, it's not going to be through offsets. Obviously, the idea is to get the emissions from the industry to be reduced, not just increasing offsetting requirements. And that's where indeed we need to look at the longer term solutions. The challenge we have is, let's imagine sort of a magical world where we get hydrogen aircraft available next year. It'll still take a lot of time to get it phased into the fleet. So it's not something that happens overnight. And I think that's a big challenge we have, is in the middle of an economic crisis that is hitting our sector very hard, is to get the airlines and to get the governments to think about what investment is needed in order to get those new technologies deployed in 15, 20 years. When you're just thinking about how many people you'll be firing in the next 3 months, it's hard to look that far.
Thank you, Michelle. I think we now have Laurence back in the call. Can you hear us, Laurence?
Yes.
Yes, great. Thank you. So I have a bunch of questions to you, and I will start with one. And it's a question from Kate Hancock. If you could explain what do you mean when you say that the EU will implement CORSIA through the ETS?
We're precisely looking at that. I think that's the principle we agreed on. That means that we will look into ways for EU operators to comply with the CORSIA obligations, subject to the differences that we find and subject to others that may be needed, depending on what we decide ultimately on the ETS review, and also, the kind of combination that we want to have in between CORSIA and the ETS to preserve the climate performance and the climate performance that is needed to match with the climate ambition we have, and the contribution of aviation that we need as part of this climate commitment by 2030. So we are looking into that. As I said, there are different options, different combinations. Either we keep the ETS and we add the CORSIA leg for the extra EF flights, or we have CORSIA and ETS being combined in a sort of complementary manner, including within the EEA, if that makes sense. If also from the point of view of administrative burden, but we'll be looking into that. What I know is that our political masters have made it clear that we will need to continue to implement the ETS, at least for intra-EEA flights. So that's the latest political guidance that we have. What is sure is that we will implement CORSIA. We've already signaled that fairly clearly with the rules that we have adopted already a while ago on MRV. And we now have the EU decision on participation. But again, subject to to preserving our policy space on a thorough assessment we will be doing against the key political and objective parameters that we need to stick to. So there's no question that we will not do it. We will do it, but mindful of all of this, combining also, by the way, our obligations under Paris and what came out of ICAO and in relation to CORSIA. Perhaps just a couple of comments on what I heard, and thanks for the very rich discussion. We've been actively involved in CORSIA negotiations from the start, and we're still, because there are still a number of issues pending, and we're still there, trying to make it, as best as possible in terms of design, and trying also along the way to make sure that we secure the necessary participation. And the two elements are key to make sure that even if the level of ambition initially is less ambitious than the one we would have wished, at least it needs to be secured, and we're not there yet. The change of baseline came up in the context that we know. It was not a request from the EU. In the end, we accepted it, subject to this being critical to ensure the continuous acceptability of CORSIA. We'll have to see whether and to what extent it is the case. I have to say, and as I said, from the beginning, we said that the objective was not necessarily ambitious enough. Now we have a change of baseline. There is a review coming in 2022 for CORSIA. So that should bring us an opportunity to look deeply into that. What baseline beyond the pilot phase? What level of ambition against a number of countries that are actually, have quite different ideas in mind as well for the review of CORSIA. And again, that, at the end of the day, will be linked to whether and to what extent they are willing to join and participate, and at which conditions, because that's what we need also to look into. Some, have indicated they are willing, subject to a number of, reservations. Others, like China, still maintain that they will not join, and they made quite a series of reservations. Now we have a new U.S. president-elect. We'll have to see. We'll have to see whether, to what extent, they make a link in between their participation and the Chinese participation, to be seen. So all that, I think, to be looked at in the run-up to the assembly in 2022, where importantly the EU, and this has been pushed for by us since quite a number of years, but again this time around we need to get an agreement on a long-term goal, in the same way as we agreed on such a goal in IMO, because precisely that's the kind of signal that we need for industry to go beyond CORSIA, to develop other measures to get into the right investment decisions, as we do in the EU. I mean, that's definitely part of the Green Deal and the path to climate neutrality by 2050. Without a strong signal, that is more difficult. And I agree that beyond CORSIA, in any case, even with an ideal CORSIA, we will need much more to happen. So just putting things into the overall context, I think let's keep all of that in mind.
Thank you very much, Laurence, and thank you also for closing in this forward-looking way. We are now already 3 minutes overdue, and so there's a lot of questions that unfortunately we will not be able to take, but I would encourage everyone to reach out to the panelists directly with your questions. They have seen all of your questions, so they will be ready to answer them. And in the meantime, I would say a big thank you for all of the panelists and all of the attendees. We had more than 130 participants here today. Many thanks for the very interesting conversation. And we look forward to seeing you in other events, and all the best. Many thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.